Welcome. Good to have you here as we talk today about supply chains and the perfect storm. I'm sure most of you have been experiencing the effects of supply chain management and what's happening or not happening, as simple as going to the grocery store and not being able to find the food, the meat, the toilet paper that you were looking for. It's some strange, interesting times at this point. And we have Dr. Carol Cagle, who's going to talk to us a little bit more about that. My name is Jeff Wolf, and I'm the director of the Center of Executive Education here at Mercer University School of Business. We're pleased to have everybody with us today. It's an interesting time, to say the least. And as I've been talking with Dr. Cagle about supply chains and where we are, where have we been, where are we going, there's going to be, I think, some information here that maybe you weren't expecting. I think it'll open your eyes a little bit. So I want to make everyone aware, at the bottom of your screen, you will see the Q&A area. If anyone has any questions, please post them there. We will get to those at the end of Dr. Cagle's presentation. And I think at this point, it's probably best to have Carol introduce herself. Tell us a little bit about you, your expertise, your background, and what you're going to show us today.
Okay. Well, thank you, Jeff. As Jeff mentioned, I'm going to describe a little bit about myself. I joined the Mercer School of Business in 2012, teaching courses in management science, covering topics like operations management, supply chain management, and business analytics. Prior to my academic career, I worked in industry for a number of years in positions primarily involving technology management in the aviation, aerospace, transportation, and defense industries. And because of my background and industry experience, my academic interests tend to evolve and have centered around solving operations and supply chain issues, especially issues relating to supply chain analytics, as well as business analytics in the data science arena. So that's a little bit about me. Now, where would we go today? First, I'd like to kind of just lay out a roadmap for how I'd like the presentation to proceed. And before I go into detail in today's presentation, let's start by describing just what a supply chain is. We often talk about supply chains, we talk about supply chain management, but often I find that what you think it means is not what it means. As the Princess Diaries say. In any event, once we have a better idea of what we mean by supply chain management, then I think we'll be in a better position to understand, or a better idea of what the events are leading up to the current supply chain crisis, and talk a little bit about why the supply chain is getting so much coverage in the press and why we're seeing some of the shortages and delays that we currently see and continue to see. I'll then talk briefly about 5 of the typical characteristics we saw in the pre-COVID-19 supply chains and how their operations were being impacted. And finally, I'd like to wrap it all up or summarize it by laying out several considerations that I believe will be instrumental for post-COVID-19 global supply chains and their long-term viability. So we get into what we mean by supply chain management and supply chains. And when we refer to them, what I think about is generally this constellation of extended enterprises, these enterprises that form multiple networks as the flow of information and resources cross multiple enterprise boundaries. They produce these products and services. Now, ultimately, these flows become the processes that enable businesses, people, technologies to meet the demand and to collaborate to add the value that is added to the finished goods and the services. Supply chains rely very heavily on the management and the flow of the products, the information, the cash, and of course the demand in order to be successful. And this occurs at multiple levels. The emphasis is increasingly being made on the global side of things because businesses and enterprises are becoming more global in their operations. And we see this as they cross multiple global boundaries. We often use something we call the PMI index, which is the Purchasing Managers Index, to gauge both the upstream and the downstream supply chain activity. And the PMI index is calculated monthly using reported data for new orders, inventory levels, production output, supplier deliveries, and of course, employment levels. And the PMI index is reported such that it uses a scale from 0 to 100, where a score greater than 50 indicates an expansion in capacity, and less than 50 would indicate a shrinking capacity or shrinking economy. Typically, you see these reported in the Financial Times because they are used pretty much as a standard indicator of the economy and the growth in the United States. This survey, the PMI index, is based on the survey that crosses 19 industries compiled by the Institute of Supply Management for Supply Management. The most recent PMI report from June was reported to be 52.6%, and it was the first time in 3 months that we saw an expanding economy. Now, there's a similar index to PMI. It's not all just manufacturing. We do talk about services. The NMI, or the non-manufacturing index, is used in a similar fashion to indicate economic growth and corporate profits across more than 60 service industries, and is also a key indicator of supply chain trend, just as PMI is. So for June, the activity reported NMI report was for 57%. So in both cases, we see expansion occurring. However, that doesn't mean that there is no shortage in products or services. In fact, there are quite a few. To give you an example of some of those shortages, more recently, there were shortages reported in cleaning products, cleaning supplies, COVID testing kits, disinfectants, PPE, things of that nature that are caused in part because of the COVID-19 pandemic. So, sorry, I went back. Why the perfect storm? What made it? What led up to this? And why wouldn't it be just the COVID-19? Well, it turns out that even before COVID-19 was declared a pandemic, the perfect storm was brewing. We see evidence of it abound, but let me give you some examples of some of the bigger events that were occurring. Obviously, COVID-19 outbreak was a big event and is an ongoing event that is instrumental in exposing supply chain issues. But some of the other substantial changes or disruptions are occurring because of things like natural disasters. So, for instance, we saw in Australia the bushfires that got started around the beginning of September in 2019 created these major infrastructure and local supply chain issues across all of Australia. And in fact, what we saw was that the fire's impact on export of the commodities was considerable, because Australia is considered pretty much a commodity based economy. It's commodity dependent. And the nickel mining industry in Victoria was temporarily suspended. And we also saw that the coal exports coming out of the production mines was in question, and whether or not it would remain viable. These were all being affected, or these were all being reported as they affected DHL shipping and delivery of products and packages. In late 2018, what we saw in the U.S. West Coast fires. The West Coast fires wiped out an entire community, including Paradise, California, where more than 2,000 supply chain workers were affected when the largest Amazon warehouse in the United States was shut down. The warehouse there in Sacramento, which is very close to Paradise. We also saw that a number of other businesses were displaced in the same area. Apple and Tesla, for instance, are two of the largest real estate holders in the area, and they're both noted for their e-commerce growth in service and orders, especially in that region. Other recent disasters that have impacted the supply chain include the earthquakes and tsunamis in 2011 in Japan. That resulted in about a $210 billion bill for damages. It also created supply chain disruptions around the globe. Primarily, take the example of Toyota. They were a single supplier for many of the parts for Lexus and Toyota automobiles. And you couldn't get a car, you couldn't get a truck for some short period of time. Hurricane Maria, another natural disaster, devastated Puerto Rico in 2017, and it affected the critical supplies of pharmaceuticals and medical supplies. Hurricane Florence decimated the budding biotech industry in North Carolina as recently as September of 28. So those are just a few indications or events that were results of natural disasters. Cyber attacks, ransomware attacks are occurring on a pretty regular basis. Just within the last week, Twitter experienced a major coordinated engineering attack, and it resulted in a number of Twitter's highest profile accounts being compromised, resulting in a renewal of concerns over data security. Political landscape with the U.S. protests, the Brexit in the U.K., we see very big impacts coming from social unrest. One of the more recent events we've seen here in the U.S. is affecting business continuity plans, accounting for transportation delays, road blockages, and increased security requirements across the board. In the UK, the Brexit is estimated to have affected more than 50% of UK business decisions over the last 5-year period, resulting in a bigger disruption or greater disruption in the supply chain than both natural disasters and cyber attacks combined, as reported in Source Today in 2019. Trade wars with China, Mexico, Canada, and Europe have created lots of uncertainty in the marketplace. For instance, General Mills, maker of cereal and soups, is relying more on third-party manufacturers here and in Europe to produce product and meet the demand for its products, resulting in significant cost increases because of the heightened competition to supplier partnerships. We're seeing that play out on several fronts. Prices for staples such as rice and wheat have jumped in many cities, mostly in part due to the panic buying that was set off by export restrictions imposed by companies eager to ensure they have sufficient supplies at homes. We've seen just as recently as today that meat shortages were brought into the spotlight in Congress just, I think, yesterday, when the packers or distributors of meat and meat products were responding to congressional inquiry regarding why those shortages were occurring, when in fact what they were really trying to do was to prevent major euthanization of animals as well as protect their employees. They were increasing the processing, but even as late as May, food was being left in the fields, labor was short, and it couldn't be processed. Supply chain pre-COVID, what does it look like? Well, I think what we'll see is that prior to COVID-19, the focus was really on the lean and just-in-time policies, and this is what allowed businesses to operate with minimal inventories, to keep up their investments and their inventories, even on critical items. There usually they were well tuned to the delays and to the delivery times, and they were able to optimize to a certain degree the management of their inventories and their operations. But because that's one of the items that made pre-COVID-19 especially critical when the pandemic affected operations. Other areas where pre-COVID-19 differs from the current times, there was and still remains this resistance to sharing data. It's too difficult and costly to maintain visibility and transparency across the supply chain for many suppliers. And suppliers tend to keep their tier 1 and tier 2 suppliers at arm's length. It just, to make real improvements is too expensive, or has been too expensive in the past. A lack of transparency and visibility across the supply chain frequency led to a resistance in sharing data that we are now beginning to break down. Intuition tended to drive a lot of the decision making versus data-driven decision making. And supply chain managers were reluctant to get out of their comfort zones. They knew what worked, they wanted to stick with the plan, and they were really tuned to managing risk rather than the uncertainty. Optimality considerations are often favored, or were often favored, at the expense of robustness. And many times examples existed, or what we saw and see going forward, is that when you look at the food and retail industries, we're seeing examples of how they were able to maintain that cost-driven focus and stay in business. For instance, by creating curbside delivery, pop-up distribution centers, and so on. Now, what about the new normal? How does that look, and how do we think it will go going forward? Well, the basics of supply chain remain constant. They don't change. We still have to manage supply in order to meet demand. How do we do it in the future? That's the challenge. Extreme increases in demand are creating shortages, not a lack of demand. We saw extreme demand in toilet paper, and that created a disruption that was totally unanticipated. However, it wasn't due to a lack of demand, it was just due to an unanticipated or extreme increase in demand. More collaboration is certainly going to be in the future between supply chain partners, and it'll be critical for increasing responsiveness and flexibility. Responsiveness and flexibility will replace a lot of the cost-driven policies that have been adopted in the past. Supply chains will need to identify and invest in the right levels of latent capacity to help them build the resilience to these shocks that occur in the new normal. And we will see that there'll be much more interest in the responsiveness and the agility that comes both with the right levels of latent capacity and the flexibility. Supply chains will place less emphasis on the economics and focus more on the politics. The uncertainty that is there has created challenges for everyone across the board. And it's not to say that they'll be less cost efficient, or it's not to say that that's no longer a critical challenge. That's not the case. It's just that the uncertainty in the political arena is driving the shift in the focus away from the economics. So we're going to see a lot more focus on the digital age. I'm sorry, I went backwards again. Sorry. The digital age is here to stay. We have to manage this obsolescence and the cost in a more effective way. Investments are shifting towards technology and automation away from capital expenditures like they've never done before. We'll see a lot more automation investments in artificial intelligence and machine learning, robotics. Recently, there was a report in the Wall Street Journal about Zion, a company that focuses on pumps for managing water, such as irrigation and water park pumps. And they are directing all of their capital investment and capital that was targeted for capital expenditures toward technological improvements. Fast decision making is going to be critical for survivability by managing risk of obsolescence and cost. These decisions will help us see trends toward data analytics, and we'll see data-driven decision making that will make that decision making not only more objective but faster. Companies that retrench in the name of making better decisions or waiting for more information or taking longer to decide will be lost in the shuffle. And what you're going to see is that the responsiveness and fast decision making is absolutely going to make the difference between whether organizations or enterprises survive in the long term. Supply chains are no longer going to be just tactical. They're going to be strategic assets, and they're going to play a very prominent role for all organizations in the future. And knowledge management and learning will be key to empowering employees even more than ever to make those informed decisions closer to where the work is being performed. Agility will also be important as a consideration as we go forward.
Carol, I'd like to interrupt for a second here before you go on to your next slide. I
Sure.
just was making a couple of notes, and I thought this might be a good time for this, but you were talking about big data. Is big data enough to deal with all the problems that are occurring now? Is that the only way we can deal with this?
Well, certainly it's not enough, but it's a step in the right direction. What we're going to see is that big data will help us make more informed decisions. It will help us make faster decisions, and those are going to be what will carry the day. But it's also going to require a higher degree of knowledge in the workforce. It's going to require a lot more effort and investment in technology and automation. So the challenges are there, and big data will be essential in making that turn towards a more viable option for many supply chain suppliers.
So can you begin to forecast the kind of skills that people are going to need? And with so many people out of work, is this a good time for them to, and let me rephrase it, it's always a good time for lifelong learning and additional learning, but what kind of skills might be needed out there as we look at this new normal?
Well, as we look forward, first we have to consider the fact that the career path in supply chain is not a well-defined or well-prescribed career. Typically, it depends on the organization you're working with or the supply chain entities that you're involved with and the specific duties that are involved in your job. So there are many ways to be successful in supply chain. One of the ways that will help you be more successful in supply chain careers is to become very good at communication. Being able to communicate and explain and make decisions, effective decisions, is critical to being successful. Learning more about and managing data, becoming very good at making at critical decision making. Those skill sets are especially important for careers in supply chain. So while they don't specifically lean in one particular discipline like accounting or finance or marketing, they are universally adaptable to the career you might have, say, in supply chain.
I know you have a couple more slides to go through, but one question that came through, I think ties in with one of your slides that you just recently completed about pre-COVID. The question is, can we ever get back to, or will we want to get back to pre-COVID supply chain days?
Well, to be honest, I don't think we do. I think that going forward, you're going to see that we will have supply chains that are more responsive to demand, and they will be more in line with customer wants and needs as opposed to the old model, for instance, where you could order any Ford you wanted back in the Model T days as long as it was black. Well, now the response is, well, I want my car and I want it with lots of options, and you want it when you want it. So I think that this will be a very good time to be going forward, not to stay where we are. That's one way I think it will be. We will not be able to go back. The other is that you're going to see more and more uncertainty, not only in the political landscape, but in the climate. And these events, as unpredictable as they are, create a lot of uncertainty that we will need to be prepared to handle. It's much easier to handle that as we go forward. I think companies are more interested in sustainability, and that will play a big role in the evolution of supply chains as well. So I don't see us going back. I do see us evolving into a different way of doing business.
Thank you. Certainly, I'll ask you to continue at this point. That was just a couple of quick questions that I thought were important at that time. So please.
Those were excellent questions. Those were excellent questions. So what I could say now is that we're in a very different time. Post-COVID-19, as I mentioned, is going to be very different. We're going to see the fallout. Smaller suppliers are going to continue to struggle. They're going to struggle with their financials. They're going to struggle with labor. They're going to struggle with being able to make ends meet and material needs. This is not going to change overnight, and you're going to see a number of these smaller suppliers struggle and fail. As I mentioned before, you're going to see higher degrees of uncertainty, and the businesses or enterprises that are able to manage this higher uncertainty, that are planning for the next pandemic now, are going to be in a much better position going forward to deal with perturbations in the supply chain and unexpected demand. They'll be more nimble, and they'll be able to realign with their eye towards the sustainability that they're going to need to be develop these relationships. As I mentioned before, we're going to see that they'll need to foster this relationship to meet the current needs as well as the needs of the future. It's an important concept when we talk about mortgaging the economic, the social, and the environmental needs of the future. So sustainability is becoming a topic of discussion and a critical topic to supply chains in general. The future is likely to have this higher degree of responsiveness. We're going to need to see more transparency, and of course that comes as a result of being more responsive and transparency. Innovations are absolutely a requirement. Innovations like blockchain are going to be instrumental in companies being successful, being able to maintain transparency and traceability throughout the supply chain. Enterprises must act quickly. You cannot delay. Now is the time for action. There's no time for indecision in times as uncertain as they are. You can't just muddle along. Long term, you're likely to be unsuccessful if that's the route you take. Finally, we need to consider that good customers, like good suppliers, are essential, and they need to be the primary consideration given their direct impact to the bottom line. Enterprises need to create and recognize the value of being preferred. Companies will play on this as we go into the future post-COVID. So, as I said, now's the time to act. There is no time for indecision. So companies that are willing to make the turn and change the carrier are the ones that will be more successful going forward. Are there any other questions, any additional questions?
There are, and Carol, thank you so much. I know you've just scratched the surface here. There's so much to really dig into about supply chains, pre-COVID, post-COVID, beyond post-COVID, just the future and where we go from there. But one of the questions that did come through, looks like somebody is looking for a future in that industry. What does a career in supply chain management look like in the new normal?
Well, pre-COVID-19, I would tell you that the career path that a normal person or an entry-level person would take would be to go in and maybe do a rotation through a number of positions, maybe one in purchasing and materials management, maybe one in operations, and another one maybe in inventory management. These would all be critical to understanding how the operation ran and how to make those relationships with suppliers and customers that are so critical to the survivability of the company work. What I would tell you now is that instead, those things still exist. You still may do a rotation, you still may get involved in various aspects of the supply chain, but you're going to see more empowerment at the level where the work is performed. You're going to see a need for knowledge workers that have more experience, and the argument is being made that, well, if people need to come in with more experience, then how do they get it? Well, there's the push now for companies to develop more internships so that entry-level career paths can be formed, and you can get a better idea of what aspect of supply chain you like working in. You may like the operations side, and it may not be production necessarily, but it could be services that you're involved in. You may like the whole logistics aspects of supply chain. How do you manage that? That in itself is a topic that we could talk at hours on, as it relates to getting product and services from point A to point B, or delivering services. Inventory management is going to be even more critical because of when you want a supply chain to be flexible, typically increases occur in inventory, which creates cost. At a time when cost is a bigger consideration and impact to the bottom line. So you're going to see more interest in automation, and you're going to see a lot more interest in data analytics, business analytics that affect the bottom line directly. So I think that's what you're going to see going forward. To get into it, I think the best thing to do is to get a strong, solid foundation in the quantitative areas. Be very good at communicating, both written and oral, and find an internship that gets your foot in the door to help you establish yourself.
So that leads to something else. And you discussed a little bit earlier about the concerns we all had with not being able to find enough toilet paper or disinfectant or PPE or your favorite food or enough beef, chicken, pork, whatever the products were. But what's got to be on many people's minds right now is all this conversation about the creation of a vaccine. Not even talking about the efficacy of it right now and how effective it will be, but just the 300 plus million doses that are going to be needed just for the US alone, let alone the world. What lessons are being learned here for this to occur in a proper way, especially when you talk about once there is a vaccine, regardless of whether it's 20%, 50%, or 100% effective, what should these developers and these producers be doing now?
Well, clearly this was an unanticipated demand, and it has highlighted or put under the microscope the fact that supply chains have to be responsive to unanticipated needs. So what we saw is that we needed to be agile in a time when we need to be responsive. We need to understand what components are necessary to make that happen. There needs to be a much higher degree of transparency and collaboration between supply chains and supply chain partners. And you see that across the board, all the way from the customer to the very upper level of the supply chain itself. In pharmaceuticals and pharmaceutical research, you're seeing an unprecedented level of collaboration that is making it possible to do the research and to get a vaccine to the market as soon as possible, not only within industry, but with government support. So that collaboration has to be there. So you have agility, you have transparency, you have responsiveness, you have flexibility. All of those dimensions play into this idea that makes the market more responsive to unanticipated demand or unanticipated need.
So I hear the word innovation, I hear the word contingency planning. In times of challenge like what we're going through, people tend to be more creative, more innovative because it's their livelihood, it's their business, it's survival at this point. Many of us just coast along doing our job, and maybe we aren't as innovative as we need to be. There's a lot of good that has come out of this, or a lot of positives in the respect of people are starting to look at, you know what, I can't just sit back and just let business go as it is. I really need to be looking at what ifs, or I need to not be satisfied with where I am right now, because the world is changing so rapidly, and it sounds like it will change even more rapidly as more people really absorb being involved with being innovative now than they ever have been.
Absolutely, Jeff. Innovation is the plan of the day, and if you're not planning for a disruption, then you're probably not going to be planning very long. You need to get out of your comfort zone, as I mentioned before, and a lot of operators in the supply chain and in operations are very uncomfortable at the moment. It's a place that they haven't been in a long time, and they're having to adopt on the fly, as we call it, and create ad hoc type processes and find out what works and make some bad decisions. Sometimes they don't all work, and you have to be ready and willing to take that chance. The times are what they are, and I think you're going to see that in order to survive and be successful, you're going to have to be very adaptable.
A lot of that sounds like our attitude, the way we are. We have a good attitude, you don't have a good attitude. I've always talked about, I look at people who are very creative, whether it's in an artistic way or just having great ideas. Can we teach people to be innovative? Is that doable?
Oh, absolutely. I am a firm believer that you can help people learn things that they felt like they could never learn before. You just have to be able to present it in a way that makes sense. And many of the things in supply chain are the things that we haven't taught in the past in business schools. I think you're going to see a shift in business schools towards more application and less theory, and you're going to see that these things directly affect how you or directly relate to how industry operates. So it'll be more of interpreting that information and being able to apply it as being able to maybe just crank the dial and crank out some data. I do believe that we can all learn to do or learn businesses and how to behave differently, and we can all be a lot more optimistic about the future.
So in your area of expertise and in your broad knowledge, and I know you've worked with businesses before where you consulted to them, you've been in the public sector before. I'm aware that companies are looking for people who can hit the ground running coming out of college, ideally with some strategic thinking skills behind them. It would seem to me that now would be a great time for companies to be looking more at either becoming a partnering more with universities to get those skills that they need and to provide some of that in the form of training, uh, because that is the new way that we are going to have to survive and have to work.
Oh, absolutely. Companies are recognizing the importance of internships, and they're recognizing that in order to get experience, you have to provide an opportunity for that experience to occur. And what you're seeing is that recognition of the opportunities is the creation that will give opportunities to first-time college graduates. It's no longer sufficient to have just a bachelor's degree or even a master's degree. Oftentimes you need that experience that you get through internships, and the companies are starting to recognize that they have a responsibility to create these opportunities so that students or graduates can gain that experience and be successful. It not only makes them successful, but it makes the enterprises successful.
I know over the years through my business, when I was running meetings and events, the individuals that I hired were not necessarily the ones who had done a lot of reading about meeting planning. They were the ones who had done it. As you said, the experiential, hands-on, that lends itself so much, and it creates a segue right now for me to just talk real briefly about executive education programs here at Mercer that we know you will be a part of as well. But we want people to be aware of upcoming programs that that are on our website. If people go to the Mercer University School of Business website, there's a number of areas under there within the centers and initiatives. We now have some open enrollment programs coming up, and it speaks to exactly what you were talking about, Carol. It is going to be hands-on. One of them is through the College of Engineering down in Macon. Program will be in Atlanta, but it's on FAA drone certification test preparation. It's not a question of people learning how to fly a drone. It's them learning the rules of the road, like getting a driver's license. They must have that if they're going to fly a drone commercially. So that's going to occur in September 12 and 19. And then we're in follow-up to last week's webinar. We did an introduction to Lean Six Sigma Yellow Belt. We're going to be offering a 2-day Yellow Belt training program certificate, and that's going to be October 9 and 16. And this is just the start of a number of programs that are coming up. We have additional webinars coming up. So in August, on August 12th, we're doing Mastering Change with or Without a Pandemic, and that's going to be with Linda Brennan. That's one of our free webinars, like what you just were witnessing with Dr. Cagle. We will be now going to a once a month webinar process. And then we're also working with the Atlanta Business Chronicle on a couple of webinars for women in leadership. Again, 4 free webinars, 2 of them occurring in August and 2 in September. And then we're following that up with some workshops. So now is definitely the time, as you mentioned here, for people to continue that training and look to the future. There are going to be opportunities out there. So Carol, why don't you go to your slide as well? So your contact information is up there. If anyone has any questions and they'd like to reach out to Dr. Cagle, you can see her information here, contact information. And we certainly thank everybody for attending. Carol, is there anything else you would like to add before we sign off for the day?
Yeah, just real quickly, if anyone has any questions or you'd like a copy of the slides, or even you'd like to continue the conversation about any of the topics we touched on. And as Jeff mentioned, everything in the presentation today was very, very high level and could in its own right be a single presentation. But if you would like to explore any of those topics, just please give me a call. Reach out, send me an email, or give me a call. I'd also like to point out that there are 3 organizations or 3 links to organizations here on the internet that you can explore. The Institute for Supply Chain Management, they are the producers of the PMI Index and the NMI Index, as well as other pertinent information for supply chain. There's the Council of Supply Chain Management Professionals, and there's the Association for Supply Chain Management, formerly APICS. All of those organizations are professional supply chain organizations, and they are a world of information. They love to talk about supply chain and some of the issues that are currently ongoing with supply chain in general. So feel free to log into those links, and if you have any questions, just give me a call.
This webinar today, similar to the previous, I think it's 15 others that we've already done since the middle of April, are all on our website. You can review them at any time. The recordings are there. We encourage you to go to our site. The site is constantly changing. More and more information is going on. We're excited about all of that. And again, Carol, I can't thank you enough for your presentation today. We hope everyone has an enjoyable rest of the day, rest of the week. Stay safe, and thank you, everyone. We appreciate it.